Good evening. I'm Jen Busak, who along with Judy Weinstein and Kim Byers makes up the leadership team of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester metropolitan area. Thank you for coming tonight. The League is a nonpartisan political organization which encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We influence public policy through education and advocacy, and we focus significant effort on registering new voters and encouraging them to get out and vote. Oh, by the way, if you're not registered to vote, or if you've moved since the election, please stop by the table. We do have registration blanks that you can fill out to change your addresses. By the way, the League of Women Voters is not limited to women. Men are most welcome to join us in making democracy work for all. So, I would like to welcome you to our forum, hashtag #MeToo to Midterm, a review of the political landscape. Actually, I think we've changed the title, the historic election results of 2018. I like that better. Yeah. Okay. Our distinguished presenters are Timothy Kneeland, Ph.D., Professor and Chairperson, Political Science and History, Nazareth College, and Adrian Hale, Strategic Initiatives Manager for the Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce. We are proud to sponsor this community conversation. The presentation will be followed by a question and answer segment, so please hang in, and please use them, excuse me, and we request, of course, that all of our guests respect our panel. Our hosts here at Asbury First United Methodist Church, and our own commitment to civil and respectful discourse. Okay. Thank you. Let's start.
I'll start. All right. All right, so. Yeah. Yes. Good. All right, so you can all hear me, no doubt. I will be talking very quickly about the general landscape. Adrian's going to fill us in on some of the details. Let me get rid of this. Oh, that's so much better. All right, so look, we just had the midterms. But the midterms don't happen just in November. The political landscape behind it occurred with the election of Donald Trump back in 2016. Almost immediately, there was an eruption of discontent led by women who found that Donald Trump was sort of the opposite of the kind of progressive politics that they had come to expect in American political life. This led, of course, to the Women's March, which occurred throughout the United States and has had iterations since then. Marches in Washington, New York, Philadelphia, and of course Rochester, and Seneca Falls, and other historic sites around the nation. But it was more than just a march. It also led to something called the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement was broke wide open with the accusations against Harvey Weinstein back in October of 2017. And so for years, many of us have talked about the kind of society we wanted to live in and the kind of politics that we wanted to have. But no matter how much we talked, no one seemed to listen. And then suddenly, it was like an earthquake occurred, and then suddenly people started to pay attention. And suddenly a number of celebrities and political figures were being fingered and in fact lost their offices because of their activities, their sexual predation. Of course, a number of well-known hosts, television figures, but also people in politics, including Senator Al Franken, were forced to resign their positions. Some women, too, were caught up in the Me Too movement because it was about respecting someone's space. It wasn't just about male dominance, but sometimes women were accused of using their positions of power to threaten others. This movement was more than just a movement. It also became an organized political activity. And, in fact, what they did is they carefully followed the script laid out by the Tea Party, the Taxed Enough Already Party, which came to fruition after the election of Mr. Barack Obama. And that led to the 2010 midterms. You may remember 62 seats switched from Democrat to Republican in that midterm election. That's the kind of script that Democratic progressive women's groups wanted to see happen in this election. They were very successful in pushing enrollment and, of course, finding NGOs and other organizations to help along in order to get more people involved in politics and registered to vote. As you can see from this national data set, since at least the midterm of George W. Bush, Democrats have been on the ascendance, Republicans have been declining, and independents are also growing some in the political environment, setting up the 2018 midterms, which were very fortunate for Democratic candidates. If you look at this chart, this is a chart of people who self-identified with their political party in a national survey. Notice how many people are independent, that is, not aligned with one of the two major parties. 40% of the country sees itself as independent, but 31% Democrat, and only 23% were willing to self-identify as Republican. So the Republican brand has taken a hit, certainly over the last couple of decades, more precipitously since the election of Donald Trump. This also happened in New York State. If you look at this chart that came out just after November enrollment figures were released, in 1 year, the number of Democrats enrolled versus the number of Republicans. My gosh, no wonder you saw those election results locally. The blue wave that swept right up through Monroe County. We're talking about, again, a significant rise of blanks. Now, these may be Republicans who no longer feel comfortable in the Donald Trump-branded Republican Party. They may be younger voters who don't feel comfortable being part of one of the two major parties, but certainly that's a number. Those are the persuadable voters. Those are the people that are going to be in the margins for elections in the future. The gender gap became quite obvious by the midterm election. That women and younger voters were more likely to be Democrats, and male older voters were more likely to be Republican. So, thinking about now the growing gap between men and women, old and young, we can see that very clearly in Monroe County. If you look at the number of people enrolled in the Democratic Party in Monroe County, 61% are women. That's a tremendously powerful force, and if you're running for office, you had better be paying attention to that.
That's right.
On the other hand, there's really less disparity in gender, a slight uptick for male-female on the Republican side, but look at how old Republicans are. Over 50% are 55 or older. It's not a demographic that you can hope that's going to win elections 10 years down the line. So Republicans have been in trouble, and things are getting worse for them. Exit polls indicated, once again, a slight change in outlook, but notice how young Democrats are versus Republicans. Democrats own the next generation of voters. They own the generation that's going to be voting into their 60s and 70s. Republicans are branded with people who right now are looking to retirement and beyond. Now, midterms are always a referendum on the President of the United States. Donald Trump did not shy away from that. He made that a signature part of his own election. But there's a couple of things we always look at before the midterm, such things as presidential approval ratings, the generic ballot, and, of course, whether the country is going in the right direction. Clearly, Donald Trump has a publicity problem. His disapproval rating is much higher than his approval rating. This is a bad sign for any president who would typically lose well over 30 seats in an election with these kind of numbers. On the other hand, if you ask whether the country is satisfied with the direction, Republicans are very satisfied. Democrats very dissatisfied. The blue line indicates how far dissatisfaction has become. And then again, if you look at the generic ballot or the generic vote, throughout the entire year, survey after survey found that the public in general wanted Congress to be controlled by the Democrats, not by the Republicans. These are all, shall we say, warning signs for the Republican Party. The 2018 midterms made history, and that's what's so interesting about what happened. We expected that the Democrats would do well. The question was, would there be a wave election? Now, typically, most presidents lose about, on average, 23 seats, 21, 22, 23 seats in their first midterm. And of course, the average is enlarged by things like the post-Watergate 1974 election, Bill Clinton's loss of 56 seats in 1994, and Barack Obama's 62 in 2010. But still, that's a pretty strong average. Democrats only needed 23 seats to win the House. So anything above 30 was going to be a strong indicator of a wave. 38 and counting. I mean, could easily hit 40 seats switching to the Democratic Party. That gives them not only control, but a good 17-seat advantage going forward to the 2020 election. When Democrats generally do better, they do much better in presidential years. This is an off-year election, usually favorable to Republicans. Something happened. What happened was this. It was the most expensive midterm in U.S. history. $5.2 billion was expended on this midterm. Insane amounts of money. And at least $1 billion can be tracked directly to female donors to political campaigns, which is the highest amount ever given by women collectively in U.S. history. Women, as the young people like to say, are woke, and they want change. And they're willing to put their change where their mouth is. And so women are active now in the political process. They're organized, they want direction, they want change. Look at the amounts of money in just New York. Gillibrand had $20 million to beat someone half the population didn't know existed right up through Election Day. Shelley Farley, no one heard of her. Now, Chris Collins had a slightly more amount from Nate McMurray, but no one paid any attention to McMurray until August when Collins was indicted. That's when the money came in. That money had come in earlier, we might have been talking about a different result, which, by the way, they're still counting in Erie County. Morelli, $1.6 million. But again, he was facing a very nice, new candidate. I won't say anything nasty about Dr. Maxwell. Seems like a very affable fellow, but he had no political experience whatsoever. And that showed in the election results. Some people get better at campaigning. I would say that Todd Baxter, the sheriff of Monroe County, started out as a really pretty awful candidate, and by the end of that campaign, he was terrific as a campaigner. I don't think Dr. Maxwell quite turned the corner on campaigning tactics. But look at Faso, who was defeated. Delgado had $8 million for a congressional race. Now, just do the math quickly. If you run every 2 years, you have to raise at least $10,000 a week to get $1 million. Okay. He raised $8 million in a very short period of time. Brindisi, $3.8 million. And they're still counting the Tenney race. We're talking about millions of dollars pouring in. Where's that money coming from? Well, it's not coming from corporations. A lot of it is coming in small amounts of money from ordinary people who want change. And that wasn't just about the money, but the money's great because you can get your message out. You can get your Facebook ads out. You can get your flyers out. You can organize. It costs money to go door to door. You need to get people out. You need to have the flyers. You need to have people out there every weekend. This is the highest turnout in a century. We're talking about a turnout of at least 49.2%. My colleague Michael McDonald runs the election project down at the University of Florida. He's a terrific political scientist, been at this for 50 years. He was staggered by this. Some people were comparing it to the 60s. No, it was much higher. We're still counting votes. it's going to be higher than 49%, 0.2%. So this was very much like a presidential year. Phenomenal year in American politics. Now, and Democrats did far better. That is, they accumulated more votes in their victory than we've seen in a long time. Now, again, some of that's California, which is the largest state in the Union, has 53 electoral votes because it's so massive. But they have practically wiped out Republicans. There's no Republicans left in Orange County in an elected office. That is the home of Richard Nixon and the place where Ronald Reagan felt most comfortable. Gone. The Republicans are now in the Central Valley, circling the wagons, ready for the next election. Not feeling good about it.
And I don't want to cut you off.
No, come in.
But I do want to say that I think it's important to recognize that different than in the Clinton midterms and the Obama midterms, you're watching literally red places go blue. Not like you had in those Democratic presidency midterms where you have purple places go red. So this is a part of the phenomenon.
Right, and that's one of the reasons we see there's a wave election, because we're seeing a switch from one party to the other, not in districts that are, shall we say, open.
Kentucky 6, Dave Brass,
exactly.
Orange County, right? And
oh yeah,
Republican
Dana Rohrabacher, who won by 25 points last time, gone, out of office. We're talking about career politicians whose careers have just been handed to them. This was phenomenal. And now there'll be more women in Congress than ever before in American history. It is a big story. It's huge. Yeah, no, this is amazing. The number of women that will be in the House and the Senate going forward. I just think back to, you may know Jeanette Rankin, who was like the first woman in the House of Representatives, voted against the First World War, voted against the Second World War, pacifist right down to the end. I mean, that makes a difference. The number of women in the House will change the dynamic. Women are moving away from the Republican Party at all levels. It is a sweep. We're talking about polarized nation based upon gender. It'll be the most diverse Congress in American history. 29%. And some very interesting historic firsts. Think about that. This is more than just women politics. This is the politics of progressive America. This is the politics of the next generation. This is the politics of this is what everyone's been talking about, the demographic change we're going to see by 2050. It's happening now. It's not waiting for 2050. We're seeing the change today, and it's going to have a huge impact upon our politics. The youngest person elected to Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 29 years old. 29 years old. Fearlessly went after a entrenched Democrat in the primary, went on to win in the House. They have dropped the average age of the people in the House by a decade, by 10 years. The young people are coming. In fact, they're here. They're not just coming. But we're still a nation divided. This is what our congressional map actually looks like. Red in the interior, blue on the coasts, blue in the big urban, suburban areas. Now, notice though, it's getting bluer on the East Coast. That blue wave that we talked about that's coming to Monroe County. Arizona and New Mexico are getting bluer by the day. Texas is starting to turn blue. It's practically purple right now, to use Adrian's term. Yeah, I mean, this is dynamic change. The interesting point, though, is that the Senate actually grew, which is a bit of an anomaly. It's only happened like 3 times in the last century. That the House was lost to one party, but the party in the opposition gained seats. We're thinking right now it's probably going to be 53 after the Florida race. Mississippi looks like it's going to go in the runoff election to the Republicans, since the top 3 vote getters, 2 of them were Republican. So
I would just say that you have to account for voter suppression.
Yes.
Voter suppression is very real in a lot of states, especially the Florida race that we just found out is going to go Republican, especially the Georgia race we just found out is going to go Republican. Even in Texas, in some places, you can talk about voter suppression being a factor. So you can see how in particularly strong Democratic congressional districts, you'll still get, like you saw on the congressional map, some spots of blue in the South, right?
Right.
You'll still get that, heavily Democratic areas. But then in the overall state, right, you have minorities and people who are vulnerable to voter suppression, votes not being counted. And so that's still a very real factor.
Well, it was interesting, Florida just voted as part of the election that they're going to restore voting rights to 1.4 million ex-felons. That's going to tremendously change what Florida is going to look like. Many of those are people of color, and therefore they will change the dynamic of the elections going forward in 2020. It will have an influence on how congressional districts are redrawn after the 2020 census. That's the other thing. These Democratic victories are happening nationwide, but they're also happening on the state level. What's happening is that rural and small town Americans are Republican, and urban and now suburban voters are flipping to the Democratic Party. The suburbs were grown at the expense of the Democratic Party. A lot of suburbs were havens for Republican voters and Republican officials. That's changing. We saw that here locally when Pittsburgh had 2 new Democrats elected to their town board. We saw that with the flip of Daniele's seat in the Monroe County Legislature in the special election. So things are changing.
And in Irondequoit.
And in Irondequoit.
Just recently a Republican flipped
Yeah.
the Democratic Party.
And Fairport, yeah. So what's happening is that the suburbs are rejecting the Republican line, particularly the line handed to the Republicans through Donald Trump's tweets. That's not going to be sustained. More educated voters, look at that. They prefer the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, the gap, educated women versus men with less than a college education. That's the new reality of the Democrat voter versus the Republican voter. And there's just not, in the long run, going to be enough of those around to sustain the Republican Party. Now, race remains a strong division. 72% of voters are still white voters. The Republicans do very well among white voters. They do poorly among every other kind of voter in America. So, again, with the demographic change, I know, surprising, right? I mean, yeah. But it's getting stronger. That division is widening, not narrowing. After the election of 2012, there had been talk by the Republicans of having a big tent and changing their ways and doing more outreach among Hispanic voters in particular, and then Donald Trump came along, who still gets a surprising 29% of the Latino vote. Division by age continued in this election. Now, the interesting thing that's happened is now, after this election, only one state remains mixed in terms of its legislature and its governor. Polarization is occurring in the states as well. All 49 states have one kind of government or the other kind. They're either Democrat or Republican. So the kind of mixed legislative or gubernatorial control is gone. Voters are making their choices, and they're flipping seats at the state level too. Hundreds of seats flipped. What to expect in D.C.? Well, gridlock, of course. Republican Senate, whose hand has been strengthened by a couple of pickups, versus House run by Democrats. Also, obviously, there'll be investigations of the Trump administration by the House Democrats, who will be doing their constitutional duty. But more so, it's going to be interesting. Everyone's going to be talking about the 2020 presidential, because we've got some leading figures coming out of the Democratic Party already. Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, Kirsten Gillibrand, and of course Bernie Sanders. Now, that's just the top of the ticket. There's at least a dozen U.S. senators in the Democratic Party who are already thinking carefully about running for president. So you might get a Republican-like primary season. You might get 17 Democrats on a stage.
You will.
It's going to be, yeah, I'm looking not forward to that. 17's too many. There are divisions in the Democratic Party that are going to emerge from this, yeah. I mean, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has already sort of declared war on the establishment Democrats. She was there when the protesters were outside of Pelosi's office, and the Justice Democrats. She has tweeted out that she wants to replace old-style Democrats with younger, more urban, more progressive Democrats. Well, that's actually good news for the Republicans. Because while the Democrats are beating each other up in the primaries to come, the Republicans can gather money and try to figure out a message.
Now, let's be clear. I want to just say this really quick because I want to parallel 2018 to 2014.
Right.
Okay, take 2014, after Obama gets reelected. What happens? Eric Cantor, majority leader, loses to David Bragg. What happened this time? Ocasio-Cortez takes out Crowley down in New York City. Fifth-ranking Democrat, probably would have made a run against Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. What else happens? More Tea Party Republicans come to Congress. The Mia Loves from Utah, and the David Bratz, and all these kinds of folks, right? What do you have this time? All the first that he aforementioned, the first Muslim, first Native Americans, first African Americans from a number of states, right? So what did you see happen in that Congress that John Boehner still sat over? Fragmentation. Boehner could not control the radical conservative wing of his caucus or his conference. So eventually it ended up leading him to just resigning his post. So what I'm curious to see now is with all these new Democrats, you're going to see, I believe, more of a conversation, a negotiation of what is our identity, what is our ideology. Because you can't expect these new electeds, the young lady from Massachusetts, what's her name? Do you remember? Presley, right? Like you can't expect all these new Democrats to govern in the same way that the more moderate, traditional establishment Democrats govern, and that's why a lot of them got elected, especially when Bernie Sanders and his PAC helped a lot of them get elected. The young lady from Kansas, the first Native American congresswoman, the first lesbian and an MMA fighter, right? So like they're going to bring a very unique, different perspective to Washington. And so what I'm curious to see is how does that take shape in the leadership in the House? How does that take shape in the policy agenda? And while we are definitely going to be negotiating that, I think Republicans are going to be figuring out how do we save ourselves, very much like they tried to discuss after Obama got elected in 2008, from losing the future. So I think even in their party, Trumpism, conservatism, moderate, like they still have a lot of fragmentation too. So I think both parties are undergoing this kind of identity search, if you will, discovering who they are and what do they mean to their voters. So I think you're going to see that on both sides.
No, I agree, and I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. Progressives have more cash and more media savvy, but moderates will claim that they delivered 24 of those seats that flipped out of the 38. That if you look in the Midwest, that a Bernie Sanders is not going to fly in the Midwest. That you're going to want someone who can meet the expectations of fairly conservative Democrats. Exit polls showed that half of Democrats who voted in this election self-identified as conservative Democrats or moderate Democrats. The other were progressive. Which is that idea that some, really quick, how many people have ever heard the saying, I am socially liberal and fiscally conservative? Rockefeller. Do you believe that they can exist simultaneously? Think they can? Okay. We're going to discuss this later, but I'm going to tell you that they can. And Vice President Joe Biden has a very famous saying, where show me your budget and I will show you what you value. And I will articulate to you why they cannot exist. That's a common misconception that you can be socially liberal and fiscally conservative. You can't be.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up. So New York also saw a change in the election. About 8 seats picked up by the Democrats, so now the state Senate is controlled by the Democrats. So now you've got one-party government in New York for the first time. I wasn't around, I don't even know when that. And so expect some really key things. You had a forum on bail here, the league hosted a forum on bail. We can expect the Bail Elimination Act to get some attention. It should pass since the sponsor is in the state Senate. The Pro-Labor Protections Child Victims Act, that should extend the time period on the statute of limitations on sexual predation on children. They're going to add new criminal and civil penalties. Gender Non-Discrimination Act, so that will provide absolute protections, not just an executive order, to protect people. So we'll see some legislation so that no matter what happens to Andrew Cuomo, those protections will be in place. New York Dream Act to make sure that people who are here undocumented immigrants will have the right to New York State tuition. And then abortion rights. And finally, something the league is all in favor of, election reform. That is going to come, absolutely. There's no question about it. And in Monroe County, well, I sure wouldn't want to be a Republican right now in Monroe County, because their elections are coming very quickly. County executive, the DA, and the entire legislature will be up, and it is not a favorable landscape for anybody in Monroe County government. And that, I'm going to turn it over to Adrian.
So I don't really have a lot to add from your analysis, because I thought it was really concise and got straight to the point. I will just say this though. We are in a time right now where I feel like America is renegotiating who it is in the face of Trumpism. And there is, I believe, underlying here, a very real fear among some Americans with the changing demographic landscape, the urbanization of America. And so I think you're seeing that play out in our politics. And so for me, what I would like to see, because I feel like there are, at every level of government, there are different attitudes and different moods and a different zeitgeist at work. And to be honest with you, it's not often that Rochester or Monroe County actually taps in to the national landscape, but we did this last time, right? And so locally, we saw the first African-American female family court judge just elected at the county level. And so what we know now is there was a commonly held belief that a minority could never win countywide. That myth has just been shattered, right? And so what kind of doors is that going to open up moving forward, and how we address some of our local issues? Because we know Rochester or Monroe County is bifurcated along the lines of race, socioeconomic background, geography, and it plays out in a whole heap of decisions that are made. So a little bit about me, I work at the Chamber of Commerce. My boss, former lieutenant governor, former mayor, former police chief, but I oversee all of the chamber's economic development, workforce development, and education initiatives. And so even amongst agencies and organizations, it's funny to see how the political world influences what party and what ideology controls what agencies, organizations, and then how decisions are made moving forward from there. And so even down to something as small as this. So, highest commercial tax rate in Monroe County. Who thinks they know where that is?
By town?
Nope, just by any municipality in Monroe County. Where'd you say?
The city.
The city, you're right, right?
Half of their properties are exempt.
Mm-hmm.
They have a large focus of concentration of exempt properties, whether they're attributable or limits.
And then, where do you think the commercial tax, commercial tax. So where do you think the lowest one is? Henrietta, right?
Yeah.
And look at how the development follows. And then when you think about the geography of jobs, and then you think about the conversation around access. So I'm curious to see how this changing political landscape, who's in power, how patronage will impact who decides what, and how that actually creates a much more equitable Monroe County. If you can pull back up some of the slides.
Sure.
To the earlier one, there was just a comment I want to make on that.
Tell me when.
Okay. Going back to the beginning.
Way back in the beginning.
Yep, back to when you had Gillibrand raise $20 million.
Oh, okay.
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 So here, so if you all remember during the primary season here, the initial split in even our own party, that's when I can see locally somewhat of the fragmentation and ideologies begin to come out. So there's a reason why Gillibrand has raised over $20 million. She has a political action committee, a PAC, called Off the Sidelines, where she raises dollars to support female candidates, right? Now, if you go back to the primary season here in Rochester, when we had 5 different congressional candidates, you had Morelli, you had Robin Wilk, you had Adam McFadden, you had
Rachel Barnhart.
yeah, Robin Wilk, Rachel Barnhart, and am I leaving anyone out?
Jamie Romeo.
No, she didn't run for Congress. That was for Assembly.
It was 4 for Congress.
Yeah, okay, so 4, right? So you had 4. And for a lot of more progressive Democrats, that was us trying to see if Monroe County had tapped into the national zeitgeist that we were seeing happening down in places like New York City, where AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was able to take out the 5th ranking Democrat in the country, right? But it didn't happen. In a lot of ways, Morelli kind of just walked in to Congress. But what we'll overlook is if you counted up the votes that Rachel Barnhart got, Adam McFadden got, and Robin Wilk, you actually have more votes against Morelli. And if you had just one other person, a similar upset could have happened here. So this is a rare moment to me when you talk about what's going on at the national level, trickling down all the way to local politics, which is important because machines matter and they're powerful and favors are real, meaning who owes you and who will publicly stand against you, who will donate money for you, who will get you canvassers. So these are all very real factors that go into someone's political viability and if they can actually win elected office or not. And so I'll be curious to see now, because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez now getting to DC and recognizing, okay, now I'm a majority of one. I'm this young, super hyper-progressive in the House that, as of right now, we're likely to believe Nancy Pelosi is going to return to the speakership. Now, nothing against Representative Pelosi. However, is that the kind of leadership you want at a moment when it's clear, based on all the data you just presented, the demographics of the Democratic Party are changing? It's a lot younger, a lot more progressive, and if you're to build on the future that you talked about and capture the minds and excitement of these young progressives now, do you want to put someone moderate who in a lot of ways represents the past, doesn't represent change, back to the helm of leadership? So I am so curious to see how that's actually going to play out. But Alexandria is trying to encourage other progressive Democrats to run in 2020. So, to Gillibrand's point of raising $20 million, I'm curious to see how much money Alexandria will get other progressives to give her so that she can help support progressive candidates, or what she calls justice Democrats, moving into the presidential campaign year. Now that's a really big deal because Democrats vote at higher rates than presidential years. So in a lot of ways, if 2018 gives us any kind of insight into what to look forward to in 2020, it's going to be a massacre for Republicans. Especially since in the Senate, Democrats had to defend more than we had to offend, right? So there's a lot more Democrats elected in traditionally purple states, like Highcamp in North Dakota, and Bill Nelson down in Florida, and all of these Democrats. Yep. Claire McCaskill in Missouri, all of whom lost, right? Because Trump has an 89% approval rating in his own party. The last time we've seen that was George Bush after 9/11. Now, when we talk about the Republican ideology of the moment, and I'm a veteran, so I just want to say that. I say that Because in many ways, I deeply believe in the promise of America. But in a lot of ways, Americans have to be honest. Because the Republican ideology right now, I think, is fundamentally un-American. It is anti-immigration. It is pro-Russia. And ultimately what it's doing is trying to calm the anxieties of folks who don't understand the changes that the nation is undergoing and that the world is undergoing. And so in many ways, the term conservative could be interjected to mean folks who want to conserve the status quo and things the way they are. Now, why do I say that that's fundamentally un-American? Because the minute that America abdicates its responsibility, I believe, as a world leader, I believe, to uphold principles that we've seen in the spirit of the country that have been overwhelming the flawed lettering of our Constitution since it was signed. So when you look at all the amendments that have come since the Constitution signing, adding to partial rights that women had, adding to the complete void and absence of rights that Native Americans and African Americans have, it's very clear that there's something in this country, there's a spirit in this country that has always caused us to progress, even in incremental ways, still progress. Now we're being confronted by a great regression, the threat of a great regression, where literally folks want to take those rights away and send some people back into second-class citizenship status. Now, I think it's important to recognize that it's one thing to not agree on policy, but to still agree on principle. But we don't share principle anymore. At least we don't share principle for everybody. And I think it's time that the Democratic Party, that I think we will see fragment over these kinds of issues. Because I think in this next Congress, I mean, you have representatives now who represent some groups who never even had a voice in the House. And what you're going to see in this next Congress is people begin to articulate these kinds of messages. The messages that say that we have to call things out. And we have to be willing to have a conversation as a country that we haven't had in a very long time. And that'll determine who we are moving into this next dispensation. And hopefully, I say we can save the country and leave it in a much better condition than the way we found it. Because I can guarantee you, as someone who's been to Afghanistan twice, the world is depending on it. So, there's going to be time for a lot of discussion, debate. I look forward to a lot of questions, and hopefully we have answers. But I think this moment, especially you're seeing amongst millennials, this moment is so important because we want to see progress. We want to see the nation continue to move in the right direction. And you have some folks who have pretty much said or reasoned within themselves that if I have a job and if the security of my livelihood is present, then all of the extra stuff that I'm unimpacted by and unaffected by doesn't matter to me. And I believe that's a fundamentally American principle. To recognize that I don't have to be confronted with a problem to make it a problem. It exists if it exists for any of us. The famous poem I'm being reminded of, and then I'm going to stop and hopefully we can open up for questions. But the famous poem that I'm being reminded of is the one by a Jewish man who was in the Holocaust who said, you know, first they came for the trade unions. I didn't stand up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the socialists. I didn't stand up because I wasn't a socialist. And then there's one more. And do anyone remember?
They came for the Jews, I think he said.
They came for the Jews. I didn't stand up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me. And there was no one to speak for me. So it's important that all of us recognize and remember that. Right? it shouldn't have to impact you to know that it's important, because if any of our rights can be threatened, all of our rights can be threatened. So.
We're at the questions.
Good evening, folks. I came here with a specific question for this panel and everybody in the room, in fact, because our election for 2020 has already started. It was immediately the day after, on Wednesday morning, people started positioning themselves and considering what do we do next and how do we influence things. Now, there was some talk about our young vote, and I think I read a headline that it didn't hit the way it might have been expected. And I want to energize everybody in this room to turn those children on, those emerging voters, those brand new voters at 18. Is there any initiatives nationwide or locally that you folks could share some info about that might help us organize a new movement of youth?
It's funny you should ask that, because so locally there's a big issue around education in the Rochester City School District. I work closely with two of the newly elected school board commissioners, Natalie Shepard and Beatrice LeBron. Jaime Aquino, the state-appointed distinguished educator, came out with a report last week. Okay, 21 findings, 84 recommendations on pretty much how to reset the district. Saturday, a group of young city politically active youth got together at the Abundance Cooperative. How many of y'all are members there? Right? Okay. In the community room, to discuss how do we ensure at a moment of opportunity when every collective bargaining agreement in the city school district is open, how do we make sure that these 84 recommendations, and at least the insight or the tacit information that they're trying to communicate to us is not lost and find their way into them, right? There are a number of unions in the district, Vente, ASAR, RTA, number of unions. All of the agreements are open right now, and so we all got together to talk about that. But there's a number of young groups right now moving, and I would say, and it's funny because my mentor Bob Duffy always says, young people aren't going to wait for the reins of power to be passed on. They're going to assume the reins of power. And one of the things I'll tell you is, even though we talk about national politics, all politics are really local. Because these are the things we touch and feel every single day. And so we recognize, at least here, that if we can't move and act when this crisis is so imminent, mind you, this is the second report to come out against our district. The first one was a financial report, there's this one, and there's an Attorney General's report coming out in a week or so to talk about the death of the young man Travion. And so we are locally energized about that, and you're going to see some things. We went to a church meeting on Friday. You were there. A church meeting on Friday in the city, and we stood up and we spoke out against this stuff. So I know locally we are active, and we're trying to figure out how to confront systems that are inherently flawed. How do we first confront them? And second, how do we try to engage in a meaningful way to produce a different outcome? For a lot of us, I mean, just looking at the board, we feel like it is inherently flawed because it diffuses responsibility. So when everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. When everyone's responsible, no one's responsible. And so we're trying to figure out now, how do we move some of our more progressive school board members into the presidency and the vice presidency to at least change the priorities, the policy agenda, but more importantly, in the long run, how do we concentrate and consolidate responsibility and accountability so that we know who's responsible for the performance of our schools? And most of all, who should be advocating in the best interest of our children and the families. So I would say there are definitely young people locally, so I'll be looking at one of them, who are active.
I'm interested in the Nancy Pelosi question. Is there a viable alternative, and who might that be, and how would someone go about trying to help make that happen?
You can answer that question in two ways. And one, if there is not a perception of, mind you, the average age of the Democratic leadership, they're all over 70. I think in some ways over 80. James Clyburn from South Carolina. What's his name from Maryland?
Steny Hoyer.
Yeah, Steny Hoyer from Maryland. Nancy Pelosi. So if there's not a viable alternative, shame on them for not grooming the next generation of leadership and no bench. But I can hear some people saying, why not Ocasio-Cortez? She just took down a leader. I can hear some people say, what about Jeffries from Brooklyn, who's an up-and-coming rising star in the Congressional Black Caucus? Some people would say, what about Linda Sanchez, chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus out in California, who came here to stump for Joe Morelli when he ran? Probably to get him to join her support down there if she so chooses to take on Nancy Pelosi. Some people might say, what about
Connor Lamb, who's more moderate, and he can attract the independents.
Sure, what about Connor Lamb, right? So there's a number of choices, but I guarantee you the argument will be, guarantee it, we don't have any young people qualified for the job.
Someone must stand up to Trump. It must be me. That's the thing. Nobody thinks that they're in the way. They all think that this is their destiny. And so until the votes go against her, I don't see Nancy leaving. And I think that that's the problem. This is their time. So, yeah.
Is it possible? Is it possible? I mean, I'm not such a fan of Nancy Pelosi myself, but in this circumstance, is it possible that they want Nancy to stay there for at least 2 years to counter Trump? Because you really need somebody who's going to go toe-to-toe with him and call him for what he is. So I don't know. Today they were saying nobody's stepping forward right now, saying that they would challenge her. So
she has a record. I'm pro-Pelosi only because why should she step aside? Kevin McCarthy, who's, I heard this on I think it was Evan Dawson's show on Friday. I could be wrong if it was Friday, but the person that was being interviewed, I thought it was on his show, but anyway, they were saying, why should she step aside? Kevin McCarthy, who's now going to be the minority leader for the Republicans, he's not stepping aside, considering that they lost weight. So I think it's a female issue. I think there's some sexism going on, and I just read an article. She's got a lot that she did
Wait, explain
for
the sexism
years.
piece.
What?
Explain the sexism piece. Because she's overseeing the minority. So when we lost the House in 2010, Nancy stayed minority leader from 2011 to president, right? So it wasn't like we moved her out of leadership. That entire leadership team has still been assembled. Her, Hoyer, Clyburn.
I think it's because
Crowley.
Kevin McCarthy's not stepping aside and having another Republican take his seat to become the minority.
Like
I think
Steve
there's some finagling going on there. But I'm just saying that Pelosi has a record of things that she has done in her past that shows that she can get a lot of stuff done when the Dems were in charge of the House.
My caveat on that is, John Boehner thought that he could school Barack Obama, and Barack Obama schooled him very quickly in the grand bargain he walked away from. And Boehner ended up losing the support of his caucus, and that is the great fear. If Pelosi, one misstep, she's going to lose the support of her caucus, and then you've got a leadership battle without a transition. You're going to have all of the factions in the Democratic Party fighting for that office. And again, that'll work right to Donald Trump's advantage. So better to have a plan of succession rather than make succession happen after the fact. Sorry.
But
We have a microphone.
I think this is a woman issue too. It's another lock her up kind of thing, because she's a woman. She has raised millions and millions of dollars to get a lot of these people elected, some of the new ones. She's been around and she can stand toe to toe against these men. I think she's a pretty great person.
Sorry, respond to me.
So I'll just say that,
It should be.
yeah, I don't think it is it's not a question of if Nancy Pelosi has the political efficacy to be the speaker. That is not in question. We know she can raise the dollars. We know that she understands the whole sausage-making process of Washington and the House. It's not a question of that. It's a question of, is she the right leader for today? Is she the right leader for this House? Is she the right leader for this House? And I'm glad that you think she. I'm sure there's a ton of other Americans across the country who also share that opinion. I would just say that there's.
No, it should be. There's a lights on.
Hello?
Ah, there will be. Here, try this one.
Hello?
There we go.
So I think it's that, and there are a number of people. I mean, I don't want us to be delusional. I mean, this is the same leader who worked with the Bush administration on a number of questionable pieces of legislation, and there is a real conversation to be had about if there are negotiations or compromises to be made with the Trump administration. And so let's just be clear about the history of compromise in this country, because I know some people view it as a good thing, but I just want to say this just arbitrarily. 1877, there's a compromise. Reconstruction abruptly ends. We don't want to deal with the racial problem in this country, and we still have the residual impact of that negligence today. At the Constitution's founding, there's a compromise. It's the 3/5 compromise that said that I am only 3/5 a human being. Beyond that, we have the Missouri Compromise, which says that we won't allow slavery to go past the state of Missouri, or if there is the addition of a free state, there must also be a slave state to maintain balance in the U.S. Senate, so that what was called at the time the slaveocracy can maintain the reins of power over the country. Make no mistake, no, we are living in a time that's hyperpartisan for a reason. The issues and problems of common, everyday Americans has, for the most part, always been neglected. And what's really being negotiated right now is the failure and end of compromise that we can't afford. Far too long, people campaigned and made promises that were never met. Whether it was a job, an education, civil rights, freedoms, liberties, the ability to determine your own fate. And so what people are doing now is they are cashed out on lies, on disappointments, and they want leaders who are genuinely going to represent their interests the same way they do for very powerful special interests. When I was in college, we looked at a scale to talk about the responsiveness of government. Who was government most responsive to? And it's not common everyday people, right? It's lobbies and special interests with powerful donation power to get people elected to act as proxies in our government. And so I think even more than, because Trumpism is a very loaded term, and it's a very confusing concept, and half the people who believe in it, I didn't know they believe in. But what I do know they believe is I don't want to be lied to. I don't want to be disappointed. And I'm not going to support anyone who's not speaking directly to my issues. Directly to my issues. So in the case that I gave in his example, if we can't even guarantee young people in Monroe County who live in this city a quality education, the game is over for them, folks. When your zip code It's a greater social determinant on your overall success. Before you even make a decision, what are we doing? And so this is why we see this moment in American politics being played out. Whether it's the small town where no one goes anywhere, or the urban center where you can't even walk to school or to your corner store. Folks have been denied real action. And they're saying enough is enough.
Okay. You know, grandparents are around to spoil the grandchildren. Nancy Pelosi's function is to be the grandmother. She's the grandmother who teaches everything she has learned to that young woman at 28. That's Nancy Pelosi's function. She teaches. And that's how in my, and I don't have any children, I have grandchildren. Well, I have grandchildren that spoil, etc. But I think that that's her function. Her function is to mentor, to teach everything, because that woman, I was reading an article and there was something that was going on and they didn't have enough, and she said, I need to take this list and look at it. And she went back, stayed up all night, looked at the list and came back and said, this is what we need to do. That's her function, is to take that list, take it apart, look at it, and teach all of these young people how to get what it is that they want, remembering that they must listen to their constituents when their constituents said to them, this is my pain. That's her function.
I'd like to bring it back local to Monroe County. Yes, there was the big blue wave, but in Monroe County, none of the seats in the state legislature flipped. The state Senate is the two most local state Senate seats. They were young, bright, articulate, progressives running. They both went down to defeat. How do you account for that?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because there was another slide where I wanted to touch on that. Never forget this, okay? Demographics is destiny. So let me talk about the Cooney race against Robach for just a second. The district is the entire northwest quadrant of the city. So if you're familiar with Rochester politics, it's Molly Clifford's, literally her district and city council. It's this little slim little piece connecting it to the entire town of Brighton, the entire town of Greece, and it just goes out to like Hamlin and all across the shoreline. Jeremy Cooney is an Indian American male candidate in a district where most of the Democrats are either Jewish, white, or black, predominantly black, when you talk about Greece and the northwest quadrant of the city. He might have had the right message, but I'll make the argument he wasn't the right messenger. And before now, do you know who actually did the best in all the challenges against Robach? Dollinger, Harry Bronson. You know who did the absolute best against Robach? Robin Bowe. Black female candidate. Look now who just won the county. Last year, Natalie Shepherd, first-year candidate, never been elected before, wins Rochester School Board, gets more votes in the general than longtime President Van White, black female. The mayor, black female. Most Democrats in Monroe County are in the 27th legislative district, pretty much 19th ward of the city, predominantly African American and female. So I'll make the argument to you, if Jeremy Cooney was a black female with that energy and message, he would be sitting in the state senate today. But I don't think that because I do think identity still plays a major role in this country, especially here. And I don't think that he was able to connect with the Democratic voters in the district enough where they didn't vote for Governor Cuomo, Kathy Hochul, Joe Morelli, and then him. They still voted Joe Roebuck. And mind you, going back to this point, Joe Roebuck has survived Barack Obama at the top of the ticket in 2008 and 2012. So that's the kind of stability he has with the Democratic voters in his district, in a district that should be Democrat.
And what about the other, what about Jen Lunsford and Funky?
Well,
It's called Ontario County.
that was a close race, so.
It was Ontario County gave Rich Funky, small town, and rural area, Republican, absolutely. And Rich Funky did not have enough opposition in the city or Monroe County, which is where he lost. He lost to Lunsford. And again, these are two candidates that were not named, were not well known outside of inner political circles. This is their first campaign, right? The next time, they better be prepared. I don't know. I suspect that this might be Funky's last race, that this might have been enough for him, and he'll settle through because they're going to be in the minority in Albany anyway. Who knows about Roebuck? Maybe somebody will flip him. Let's see. He flipped once.
And just to add to that point, again, go back to that district, 55. Most of the Democratic votes in that district are, again, in the east side of the city. And I live in this, I felt like Lunsford's presence in the city was light. So I think she could have had greater turnout in the city. But again, I mean, I would just make the argument all day, demographics is destiny.
But campaigning and candidates, you cannot underestimate the power of making connections with voters and telling them your story and why you should be replacing someone who, you know, Roebuck is not considered to be a threat or an impediment. He and Morelli just gave $1 million to Brighton for an indoor farmers market. They teamed up together. This is the kind of politics that goes on in Albany.
The Little League field.
Yeah,
the grill
exactly.
for our church.
Yes, thank you. It's the ribbon cutting, and don't underestimate the incumbent's power. But yeah, Funky became nearly close to being, you know, in a race that no one thought was going to be that close. So.
Yeah, I just got to say, I worked on Robin Wilt's campaign. She got crushed. There's no way a black female is ever going to win in that district. And here's why, all right? So, Joe Roebuck is probably the best politician that we have in this area. Now, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with his policies, all right? His politics, all right? He's everywhere all the time. He has a ton of money. I volunteered on Jeremy's campaign. There was no way he was going to beat Joe Roebuck. There's nobody that's going to beat Joe Roebuck. When you look at his personal history, and he's got a lot of skeletons that are like scandalous, and when you look at the money he has, you know, he's very, very good. He's on DKX, the water cooler. When you see him march in the Labor Day parade, it's almost his entire contingent are people of color. And this is the funny thing is, I was at one time when we were doing the Reproductive Rights Act, I'm in Greece at a protest in front of his office. And I have women telling me, you know, I feel so bad about doing this in front of Roebuck's office. And I would say, do you understand that he is probably one of the most, when you look at his voting record, one of the most conservative senators we have in New York State. The problem is the electorate, which is, and I don't know if he's ignorant, half the people that vote for him think he's a liberal Democrat. Because if you ever go out with him, he'll never really speak about issues. But he's an excellent politician. So, I just have to say, having worked on those campaigns, I don't know, Joe's there as long as he wants to be, because he's a very, very good politician. And that gets into, personality. And I think that's what happens. Well, Funky, look at the only reason Funky got elected the first time was one, Ted O'Brien was an anomaly. It's a red district. He's the Buffalo Bills. The only other comment I'd like to make is I do question, the thing about the compromise net. And we talked earlier about, when no one's in charge. Look at, the bottom line is our system, this is a failed experiment. And as much as Americans, we like to think that this is a great constitution and all this good stuff, the problem is our parliamentary systems work much better. And one reason is because you don't have to have compromise, you can do consensus. Until we get to a consensus form in government, we have to compromise. As long as we have to compromise, all right, we're not going to make, well, let's put it this way. The form isn't going to get any better. And then if I can make one last, and if you're familiar with, and this is where I question and challenge, the idea about the young woman from New York, OSC, ACA, ACLU, whatever her name, yeah.
AOC.
So, and I'm interested in this too. Pelosi's going to be Pelosi's going to be the leader. All right. You know who assigns the offices, you know who assigns the staff, and you know what committee she's going to be on. When she ends up in the basement with one staff member, no phone that works, and she's on the farm committee and some other committee where she can't do anything, she will get the message that this is the system. So, your comment.
First off, I appreciate all of your comments and your perspective. Okay, that's first and foremost. In addition to that, though, I'll say this, going back to the Robox, his district. I think that what you're going to continue to see moving forward is Democratic candidates taking over Monroe County. And those kinds of statements about what type of person will never win a district continuing to be proved to be falsehood. Just like a black female would never win Monroe County, but just won Monroe County. A Democrat will never be sheriff, but we have a Democratic sheriff who's been a long time incumbent. And now we potentially next year could have a Democratic county executive and a Democratic majority in the county legislature for the first time since, I think back in the day, there was a gentleman, he's over a bit. Yeah.
One-term time.
Yep. So I think you're going to continue to see those kinds of comments being proven to be false more and more. The second comment you made about Robach being an excellent politician, I don't think anyone disagrees with that statement. Right? I think Joe Robach, we all know he's a great politician. But going back to my main comment, and the thrust of it being behind, demographics is destiny. When you line the right messenger with the right identity or the right personhood, then you watch those kinds of folks fall. Perfect example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. That district's changed. That is a Hispanic district now. And Crowley, in his arrogance, sent a young Hispanic female proxy to the debate. To debate against her. He didn't even show up. And it still counted him his seat. Because in that case, you had the right messenger speaking the right tone. I mean, we're talking about abolish ICE. Abolish ICE. Not reform ICE, not change it, abolish it altogether. And she got elected. And I got news for you. She can be put in the basement in her first term, but she will get some of those Justice Democrats after 2020 and 2021. And they will prove to be very important moving forward, just as much as the Freedom Caucus was on the Republican conference. So 1 term, and on top of that, she is a national star. She will use the bully pulpit. She will energize young people, and they will vote. And she'll also impact the 2020 presidential race. Because there's a young Texan who will probably be in that race who will do better than I think everybody's expecting, and his name is Beto O'Rourke. He didn't win the Senate, but he will be a competitive presidential candidate, you bet your bottom dollar he will be. So, I guess my main thing I just want to communicate to you is America's changing. Things are happening that we've never seen before. And we have to begin to think beyond the boundaries and constraints of convention, because that's the only thing holding us back at this point. Your nation's first lesbian, Native American, former MMA fighter, congressional representative isn't from Oklahoma. She's from Kansas. Kansas.
Kansas used to be, well, but
Kansas.
This, if I might want to just say, this is sometimes I think that
Your first LGBT governor, your first LGBT governor, not in California, Colorado.
Kansas was traditionally, sometimes I think young people don't, no offense,
You're fine.
the history. Kansas was at one time the hotbed of progressivism, the progressive movement in the United States. I've seen, you know what, when we say we haven't seen this before, yeah, we've seen this before.
One more question.
One more.
I'm the last one? I wouldn't practice more, so I can't, I don't want to upset Nancy Pelosi's run that she's making, which all of you have supported, but I want to make an observation.
No, not everyone.
Well, I counted a few over here. The point I would make, though, is there was reference made to her age, to her sex. I don't know that race came into it, but I just want to mention, those are 3 things she can't change. She can't change her thinking. And I heard some mention of that along the way here. And I think she's been very good at doing that. So to write her off based upon what her record has been would be not to give her credit for looking at the situation and sizing it up. And I think making the list probably tells the story very well. So I can't help but think, and as much as I'm impressed with data, there's a tendency to try to mix the things that people can't change, like the 3 I mentioned, with the things that can be changed. And it's those changing dynamics that seem to make the difference in the races as I look at it. To which I'll add one more thing. I determined that you can't just look at what people are for, you have to look at what they're against. And I find many people who are for Trump, not because they particularly like him, they can't stand Hillary or Obama or some of those people. So there's a push-pull in here, which I did not sense in your analysis earlier, and I just wanted to make that point to you. Thank you.
If I'm understanding you correctly, going back to Nancy Pelosi, you're saying that the factors of her identity that she can't change shouldn't be held against her?
No, my point was that when you try to categorize with those as starting points, you come to a conclusion and you begin to think that she can't do the job.
No, 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 quite the contrary.
I'm sorry, I'm just finished.
Go ahead.
My point is, you have to give her credit for changing along the way and sizing up the situation. If I can believe what I see on the news, she has brought a lot of young people along. The minute you see her as an older person, you think that she can't do anything for the young people, and in fact, I believe she has. I mean, I just been consuming the news too much. But my point would be, don't write people off for the things they can change, and a skilled person like her will size up where her strength is, and she'll act accordingly. I predict that's what you had to conclude in the past.
So, to your point, I'm confused by it only because I thought I made it very clear that no one questions, I believe I said no one questions her ability to do the job. I said to understand the sausage making process, to raise a ton of money. Her efficacy as a leader is not being questioned at all. What I said was, with the changes in the country, meaning what people actually want, is she the right leader for this particular moment?
How do you know? Because you're looking at her record.
Of course I'm looking at her
Well,
record.
but her record is what she saw as she lived through that period of time.
Yes.
Her record would be different.
But I will give you this. So let me give you the most recent one. So let's just watch her
And
whole
when you
record.
say that, respond to me, I'm satisfied. You done a great job, and
Oh, no, thank you. No, I appreciate that. But I do want to say this because I think understanding is important, right? So, let's look at the most immediate example we have to give a reflection or some insight into her thinking. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is elected to Congress. The nation is shocked. She's on all the headlines the next day. Nancy Pelosi comes out to give a press conference, and they say, Nancy, is she the future of the Democratic Party? What did she say? No. That's one district. That's one place. She is not the future of the Democratic Party. So I want us to be clear about the context to her thinking that I'm referring to in regards to why I'm not 100% sure she's the proper leader for right now. Because you would think, and you saw this in the presidential campaign of 2016, when Bernie Sanders electrified the Democratic Party. Agree or disagree with him. But the Democratic Party should have stoked that fire, encouraged that energy and enthusiasm. But in many ways, we try to stifle it and put it out. And what you're watching is establishment Democrats try to do the same thing now. That is not leadership today. That's not leadership.
There you go.
Thank you for joining us tonight and participating in this important discussion. We're so grateful to our excellent presenters, Tim Kneeland and Adrian Hale. You'll find information about the League of Women Voters on the table in the foyer. And of course, if you're not registered or moved since the last election, we have voter registration forms along with samples of our educational and membership materials. Please be sure that we have your email address so that we may share with you a summary from this evening. Actually, it's going to be on our website. You'll see the, Elaine, you're going to have that, you're going to have a video tonight up on our website. Please look for it and let everybody know it's there, those who couldn't be with us. Excuse me. The League presents 6 forums per year, 3 in the fall and 3 in the spring. And please let us know if there are topics of special interest to you, and please consider joining us. Thank you. Tim and Adrian.